Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Topper, and welcome to my podcast. In this episode, we are going to be examining the current application of the New Tech High project-based learning. I'd like to begin by first formally defining PBL for those of us who are unsure. PBL at its core establishes a system of learning that, you guessed it, partitions our school curriculum into various projects that seek to develop student skills such as communication, critical thinking, time management, and our knowledge. Students are frequently put into teams but are often graded individually according to rubrics that lay out specific guidelines and requirements. Although this may all sound like an excellent alternative to traditional learning, the modern project-based learning has severe and unavoidable problems that prevent it from achieving its most effective form. In its current form of functioning, it has become an educational show business. Almost everyone would agree that the primary purpose of developing a new system of learning would be to improve upon the actual education itself, thus preparing students for college and their future careers. This, however, is not the case. According to the California Department of Education, a mere 39.53% of students in the year 2017 to 2018 at New Tech High met the math benchmark on the SAT, which is pretty sad compared to the Napa Valley Unified School District average of 52%, keeping in mind that New Tech is the only PBL school in the district. I attribute the discrepancy between percentages to the way that teachers are forced to design projects. For example, coupling math with a non-traditionally related subject like art. This in turn causes teachers to align with the system that PBL thinks is best, compared to what actually prepares students for their future. Here's an interview with Jonas Valenzuela, a New Tech High student who offers a lot of insight and experience within the functioning of PBL.
How long have you been involved with PBL?
For 7 years now. Ever since middle school, I went to River Middle School. It was kind of like a segue into PBL for New Tech. There we got experience in PBL with various projects that we did. It was a good model for how high school was going to be.
Do you think that the PBL curriculum has prepared you for your future career?
No, just because my future career, I think, is highly sort of specialized in one field, and because PBL doesn't really offer such specific focus, it hasn't really enabled me to do that. However, due to the fact that we can take college classes, I feel like that has enabled me to be more prepared just because I can be more specialized in those areas.
In a self-conducted survey, I asked my peers in my political studies class the following question. Do you think New Tech's PBL is the best it could be in its current way of functioning? Of the 59 respondents, 2 answered a flat-out yes, and 57 answered no, could use some work.
How do you think PBL has affected your learning?
PBL has affected my learning by giving me some experience in the real work field. However, as a student, it has partially had its negative effects on me, particularly in standardized testing. I feel like because New Tech doesn't emphasize, or just PBL in general doesn't emphasize standardized testing, that I don't get as much experience as, say, other schools.
Students, on the other hand, are subjected to various educational hurdles as well. Consider the hypothetical that students are allowed to work with whomever they choose instead of being forcibly assigned to a group of students who may or may not put any effort behind the project. Administration and teachers alike would object to this notion, claiming that many students would become off-task and failing rates would propel higher than seen before. Nonetheless, this should be of no fundamental concern. Hardworking students will naturally gravitate to other hardworking students, just as the students who are forced into attendance will also associate with other students who feel the same sense of powerlessness. Jonas goes on to explain some of the experiences and flaws he's encountered with PBL.
Have you identified any significant flaws with PBL?
I have, some of which include team projects, working with other people who may or may not be as passionate about a project or just not passionate about their learning. Starts of projects can be very slow due to various minimal tasks, say team contracts or things that we've been doing for years. I think everybody who's doing PBL already knows and has been through it. Obviously, this doesn't really hold true for, say, like freshman year. Freshman year, I think, would be a good time to introduce those team contracts. However, by the time you get into, like, say, even sophomore year, those should already be, thrown out the door.
I argue that even through the encouragement of team-based autonomy, students are required to excessively document themselves through means of team contracts, team meeting notes, benchmarks, and the rarely truthful peer feedback. This documentation, in turn, affects the independent process of project planning, self-accountability, deliverable benchmarks, feedback, and autonomy that students are supposedly encouraged to fulfill.
Do you think PBL should be widely spread as the new educational standard?
No, because I don't really think it follows a standard. Scoring and scores on projects are pretty subjective as to whether or not a student actually participated or whether they just rode on the backs of other students. I feel like that's also one major flaw.
Here's Jonas, finishing it off clearly for you.
Would you be in favor of a PBL reform that would seek to resolve the problems with PBL that you identified earlier?
Yes, I think that would be a good idea.
Indeed, this instilled system of grading paves the path of flaws that are long overdue for reform. Students are tasked with giving feedback and assigning a collaboration grade to team members at the end of a project. Once again, on the surface this appears to be an effective and completely reasonable way of grading, though the student cannot be trusted to provide an honest grading when their own grade may suffer due to repercussions of honesty. Take, for example, an honest student gives a poor collaboration grade to a lazy group member. In spite, the lazy group member hands a poor collaboration grade to the honest student because he or she felt offended that they were deemed lazy. I also conducted an interview with a math teacher at New Tech. Here's what Ms. Parsons has to say.
How long have you been involved with PBL? Was it easy to make a switch from traditional methods?
So I've been at New Tech, which is my first experience with PBL this is my 4th year. The first year I was not in the classroom, so that gave me kind of a different introduction to it than if I had just jumped in the classroom. And there were definitely some challenges that came along with it. I think one of the biggest struggles for me was difference in grading and also just designing the curriculum.
Okay, and how has PBL affected your teaching and curriculum once you got involved with it?
Yeah, well, I think it's always great to learn new things, and so I think it was strengthened my teaching because it gave me more tools kind of to put in my toolbox and to use in the classroom. So I use a lot of things from my past experience also, but I think it's been really great as far as the collaboration and looking at things like integrated projects and how teachers collaborate on a whole nother level than I've ever experienced before. In the past, I was very isolated in my own classroom, so that's been a definite support in how I teach.
Ms. Parsons has had plenty of experience learning PBL and refining her teaching skills, though that's not to say she hasn't had her fair share of some drawbacks. Here's what she has to say.
Do you think PBL has positively affected the kids? Does it have any significant flaws that you've realized?
So I think that PBL as a whole is a great way to learn. I think a lot of the flaws can come in within, because not every teacher does it the same. Not every teacher designs the same type of project. So I think a real challenge for many teachers is designing a project that has all the elements that can make students successful. It's a lot, and I think even teachers that have been teaching for a while, there's still elements that they may not have incorporated. And so I think if we think of like the ideal project, that it's wonderful. But do we always get to that ideal project? And so I think it really depends on the teacher and the classroom and the school that it's being implemented in.
As a math teacher, do you think that PBL flows well with the current curriculum, or do you have to force it into your projects and what you teach?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It has been more of a struggle for math for me. A lot of schools that do PBL have transitioned from doing project-based learning, and in math they do problem-based learning, which has a lot of similar elements, but there's a lot of differences as well. Because I've been on the 9th grade team and been working on integrated projects, I've had to use math not as problem-based but as project-based, and that has been a huge challenge for me, and I do feel like a lot of times it is something forced. However, when I look at problem-based and taking the elements of inquiry and questioning and things like that, I think it's great and it still applies. It just looks somewhat different in the ideal situation.
Yeah. If you could tweak PBL in some way, what would you do and how would you do it?
Oh man. I'm not sure. Well, as a math teacher, for math, I would definitely switch from projects to problems. So that's more of not PBL as a whole, but for me in my context, I would definitely do problems. The grading is another thing that's a challenge for me. I think as a school for us and maybe other places too, I don't know, kind of rethinking what grades mean to us and reevaluating that. But I don't think that's a PBL thing. I think that's just a system thing here. But in general, I love that PBL is ideally authentic and based on things that happen in the real world, and I think it really prepares kids for the real world if done well.
Okay, and then the last question. Do you think PBL should be a more widespread program?
I think that depends. I think that, it is spreading as we speak. A lot of schools are starting to become project-based learning. But for example, our district went to being all PBL schools, but the implementation wasn't done well. So I think that if we implement it, it needs to be done well, not just do it to do it. And also, there's a lot of teachers who have been teaching traditionally that don't want to teach in a PBL setting, and so there's a lot of pushback. And so I think that if we're spreading this, we need to do it the right way, and it needs to be teachers that are on board and that have the proper support and training in order to make it a successful thing. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Herein lies the flaw of PBL's defined methods of grading. And keep in mind this is based on my own anecdotes. There are always exceptions to the system. In politics, the PBL concept is unspoken of. Education, on the other hand, is frequently spoken about by nearly every political party. Every major political party seeks to fulfill a new fundamental goal: to provide the highest quality education, to support low-income families break free from poverty, and remove social problems such as racism. Aside from these, each party expresses its own ideas on what an ideal education should look like. The Democrats and Republicans believe that education should continue to be controlled by the state, which in turn keeps schools up to Common Core standards. When it comes to higher education, the Democrats and Republicans directly butt heads with one another. The Democrats believe that college should be free or considerably cheaper than it is now, where the Republicans advocate for a college as a must-be-willing to pay for a higher education type environment. Libertarians and the Green Party agree that Common Core standards for K-12 should be abolished, though they greatly vary in other beliefs. Libertarians argue that parents and communities should have absolute control over the education of their children, but the Green Party still seeks out that schools are federally funded and have no ties with any private funding at all. I'd like to end this episode with a reminder that this episode was made to simply point out the issues in the current application of project-based learning, but entirely neglects the positive aspects. PBL has some serious tragic flaws, though with due reform, the educational system could be well on its way to becoming a new widespread standard. Once the issues of peer feedback, assigned teams, ineffective math programs, and the excessive need for documentation are resolved, or at least reconsidered, the primary setbacks will no longer plague the functionality of the education.